Before the first spoonful of sugary cereal ever hit a bowl in 1950s America, there was another breakfast. One made from flour and water and a little bit of grease. One that filled a stomach for pennies and kept a farmhand working until noon. One that your grandmother probably ate every single day of her childhood and never once thought to write down, because why would she? It was just breakfast. And today, almost nobody remembers it exists. We like to imagine the 1950s as a decade of abundance. Chrome kitchens, gleaming refrigerators, a bowl of corn flakes and a glass of orange juice on every checkered tablecloth. That image is real, but it's only half the picture, and it's the half that television sold us. The other half, the half lived by farm families, factory workers, coal town wives, and anyone still carrying the lean habits of the Depression and the ration books of the war years, looked a lot more humble. And honestly, a lot more resourceful. Let's start in the farmhouse kitchen, because that's where a lot of these breakfasts were born. Picture a cast iron skillet already warming on the stove before the sun is even up, because there are animals to feed and fields to walk before anyone sits down to eat. The mother of the house isn't reaching for a cereal box. She's reaching for a bag of cornmeal that's been sitting in the pantry since the fall harvest. She mixes it with water and a pinch of salt, lets it cook down into a thick porridge, and then does something clever with it. She pours the leftover mush into a loaf pan and lets it sit overnight in the cold pantry or the icebox. Come morning, she slices it, dredges it in a little flour, and fries it in bacon grease until the outside turns crisp and golden while the inside stays soft and almost custardy. That's fried cornmeal mush, and in Pennsylvania Dutch country and across the rural South and Midwest, it was as common as toast is today. Drizzle it with sorghum syrup or a little molasses, and you had a breakfast that cost almost nothing and stuck to your ribs for hours. Then there was milk toast, which sounds strange to modern ears but made perfect sense to anyone counting pennies. Stale bread, the heel of the loaf nobody wanted, toasted until it was firm, then set into a bowl and covered with warm milk that had been thickened slightly with a bit of butter and flour, maybe a whisper of sugar or cinnamon if the household could spare it. It was soft, warm, comforting, and it used up bread that would otherwise go to waste. Mothers gave it to sick children and tired husbands alike. It wasn't fancy. It was practical. And in a decade when wasting food was still considered close to a sin, practical was the whole point. Cream chipped beef on toast deserves its own mention, mostly because generations of American servicemen came home from World War II and Korea still craving it, bad nickname and all. Dried, salted beef, sliced paper thin, was cheap because it didn't need refrigeration and could be bought in small quantities. Cooked into a simple white sauce made from flour, butter, and milk, then ladled over toast, it turned a few ounces of preserved meat into a breakfast that could feed a whole family. It shows up in military mess halls, it shows up in Midwestern farmhouses, and it shows up in city apartments where a nickel saved on breakfast was a nickel that could go toward rent. Biscuits and gravy get talked about today like a southern specialty you order at a trendy brunch spot, but in the 1950s it was survival food, plain and simple. Flour, lard or bacon drippings, a little baking powder, and buttermilk if you had it, water if you didn't, made a biscuit that cost almost nothing to produce. The gravy was often nothing more than the leftover fat from cooking sausage or bacon, thickened with a spoonful of flour and thinned with milk or even just water when milk was scarce. It was rich, filling, and stretched a small amount of meat across an entire family's breakfast table. Some households didn't even have the meat drippings and made what old-timers called water gravy, just flour, fat, salt, and pepper, poured over a biscuit and eaten without apology. There's also the simple, almost forgotten act of bread and drippings. After frying bacon, the fat left in the pan wasn't thrown away. It was poured into a tin can and kept on the counter or in the icebox, and in the morning, a slice of bread would be spread with that solidified bacon fat the way we'd spread butter today, sometimes with a sprinkle of salt, sometimes toasted first. It sounds almost too simple to be a meal, but for a lot of working families, it was breakfast, full stop, especially in the days between paychecks. Oatmeal, too, looked different than it does now. No little paper packets with dehydrated apple bits and cinnamon flavoring. Just steel-cut or rolled oats, cooked slow on the stove, sweetened if you were lucky with a spoonful of molasses or sorghum syrup rather than sugar, because sugar cost more. Some families thinned it with the last of the previous night's milk. Others topped it with a pat of that same bacon drippings instead of butter, because butter was often sold or traded rather than eaten at home on a farm that produced it. Down south and in Appalachian households, grits played the same role oatmeal did further north, boiled corn ground down to a coarse meal, cooked until creamy, and eaten plain or with a little of whatever fat was on hand. Scrapple did similar duty in Pennsylvania Dutch country, using literally every scrap of the hog, the trimmings, the organ meat, the parts other people threw away, mixed with cornmeal and spices, formed into a loaf, and fried up crisp for breakfast. Nothing on that hog went to waste, and Scrapple was the proof. Even something as small as an egg got stretched. Egg in a hole, sometimes called toad in the hole depending on where your family came from, took a single egg and made it feel like a full breakfast by frying it directly into a slice of bread with a hole torn out of the center. One egg, one slice of bread, and suddenly you'd fed someone a meal instead of just a snack. In leaner households, sometimes there wasn't even an egg to spare, and it was just the fried bread with a smear of dripping standing in for the egg that used to be there. What all of these breakfasts have in common is that they came from a mindset, not just a recipe box. That mindset was carried by the generation that had lived through the Great Depression, and it didn't disappear the moment the war ended and the economy boomed. Farm families in particular held on to these habits because farm life didn't change as fast as city life did. You still had chickens to feed, cows to milk, and fields to walk before the school bus came, and that kind of morning called for a breakfast that gave you fuel, not a breakfast that gave you a cartoon mascot. So what happened? How did an entire culture of resourceful, homemade breakfasts practically vanish within a generation? The honest answer is advertising, and it happened fast. By the early 1950s, companies like Kellogg's and Post weren't just selling cereal, they were selling a lifestyle. Cartoon tigers and talking elves showed up on television screens that were newly sitting in American living rooms, and they weren't talking to the parents who remembered rationing coupons. They were talking directly to the children, who then turned around and begged their mothers in the grocery store aisle. A box of cereal took 30 seconds to pour instead of 30 minutes to cook, and in a decade that was falling in love with convenience, that math was hard to argue with. Milk toast couldn't compete with the cartoon rooster crowing about how great your morning was about to be. Then came the freezer case. In 1953, a company called Eggo introduced the frozen waffle, and it changed breakfast forever. No more mixing batter, no more standing over a hot griddle before sunrise. You pulled a waffle out of the freezer, dropped it in the toaster, and breakfast was done in under 2 minutes. Frozen and packaged convenience foods exploded across the decade, riding the same wave that brought Americans TV dinners and instant everything. The suburban kitchen of the late 1950s was being marketed as a place of ease and modernity, and anything that reminded people of hard times, of drippings jars and stale bread and stretched-out egg breakfasts, felt like something to leave behind, not something to be proud of. There was also a generational embarrassment tangled up in all of this that doesn't get talked about enough. For families who had lived through real hunger during the Depression, dishes like milk toast and water gravy weren't nostalgic comfort food, they were reminders of scarcity. As soon as prosperity became available, a lot of parents were eager to give their children something new, something that didn't carry the taste of hard times. Buying a box of Corn Flakes wasn't just convenient, it was a small, quiet declaration that things were better now. Unfortunately, that meant an entire body of practical, resourceful cooking knowledge got left behind along with the hardship it represented, and it was rarely passed down on purpose. Home economics classes shifted too, moving away from stretch-your-dollar cooking and toward the modern, appliance-driven kitchen that manufacturers were eager to promote. Refrigerators with bigger freezer compartments meant families could stock up on frozen convenience foods instead of relying on what was in the pantry or what the morning's chores produced. Slowly, kitchen by kitchen, the skills required to turn stale bread and bacon grease into a satisfying breakfast simply stopped getting taught, because nobody needed them anymore, or so it seemed at the time. Looking back now, there's something worth sitting within these old breakfasts. They weren't glamorous, and nobody is suggesting you trade your morning coffee for a bowl of water gravy tomorrow. But they represent a kind of quiet ingenuity that fed real families through real hardship, using what was already in the house, wasting nothing, and turning a few cheap ingredients into something that kept the body going until lunch. That's a skill, not a deprivation, and it's a little sad that it got erased so completely by a cartoon tiger and a 2-minute waffle. So the next time someone in your family mentions that their mother used to make something called milk toast or fried mush, don't laugh it off as some strange old habit. Ask them how it was made. Ask them what it tasted like. Because that recipe, simple as it sounds, is a direct link to a version of America that knew how to make almost nothing stretch into enough, and that's a kind of wisdom worth remembering, even if we never have to live it ourselves.